Hey, Squid.
Oh, you look a little glum.
Yeah, I'm just feeling grim about the mouth.
Oh, like one of those damp, drizzly November's in the Souls kind of moments?
Yeah, I just been thinking that it's high time to go to sea.
You're in luck, Whale.
Oh?
So we're going to be reviewing New Bedford today. New Bedford is a light to medium worker placement and resource management game for 1 to 4 players, set in the golden age of the whaling industry in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Players help build up the town by buying buildings and placing them in their respective districts. They also visit buildings in order to collect resources. They then use these resources to further build up their districts and then set sail on their whaling vessels in hopes of capturing as many whales as possible. Players must balance out their land and sea ventures as whales become more sparse in the ocean the more whaling vessels go out. In the end, the player who has returned the most whales and built the best district will win the game.
As in most Euro games, the point of New Bedford is to collect the most victory points. You're primarily going to be doing that by collecting and returning these whales through the course of the game.
But don't forget that buildings also give you victory points. Each round, players will have 2 and only 2 workers to place to take the various actions, either in the town or in the dockyard.
The starting player token is going to pass clockwise around the table, so every player will have an equal number of turns to be the starting player in the game.
Any number of workers can be placed in the buildings in the town center.
But the first player in the town center does get a bonus for getting it.
This is in contrast to the player-constructed district buildings, where a max of 1 and only 1 worker can be present on a building at a time.
In order to construct a building in this game, you need to send a worker to the town hall, select the building you want to build, pay the appropriate resources, and put it into your district.
Most buildings give additional actions that all players can take advantage of. The only exception are a few buildings that give victory points only to the builder of those buildings.
The nice thing about the buildings with the actions is that if another player were to come and take my building's action, they would then have to pay me 1 gold to do so. The non-building actions in this game regard readying your whaling venture.
And this is a 2-step process. First, you must spend an action to prepare your ship. Then, you need a secondary action to launch your ship with enough food to sustain your crew.
The more food that you spend, the longer that your ship will be out at sea.
After the action phase, all ships move 1 row closer to the harbor.
Ships that are still at sea are going to have the opportunity to go fishing for some more whales.
Tiles are drawn from the ocean bag, equal to the number of active ships plus 1.
Starting with the ship furthest out to sea, every boat will claim 1 tile. There are 4 kinds of tiles in the ocean bag.
The first is the sperm whale. This is the rarest tile in the bag. These whales cost the most to return, but they also give you the most victory points.
Bowheads represent the middle ground, while right whales are the most common. They only cost $2, but they also only give you 1 victory point.
The last type of tile operates a little bit differently. This is the open ocean tile. These are not claimed by boats or players. Instead, at the end of the whaling phase, they are returned to the ocean bag.
What that means is that over the course of the game, the proportion of ocean tiles increases, decreasing your chances of drawing whaling tiles.
As we saw in the 19th century, overwhaling is a serious issue, as overfishing continues to be today.
When your ship returns to harbor, you must pay for your whales if you want to collect the victory points.
The cost of each whale is listed in the top left corner of each tile.
If you can't afford to pay for the whales or don't want to pay for the whales, you can put them up for sale.
When you do this, you receive half the cost of that whale, but then the other players get the opportunity to buy the whale for its cost and gain the victory points.
Thank you very much.
The game ends at the end of the 12th round.
But every ship that's still at sea will have the opportunity to continue whaling until they've returned back to the harbor.
At the end of the game, victory points are counted from your returned whales, as well as any victory points gained from buildings.
Player with the most victory points becomes the hero of New Bedford, I think. Yeah.
Something.
Yeah.
Mayor?
So, that's the game. Thanks for watching.
Well, isn't this a review show? We haven't
right.
said anything about.
Okay, let's get into
the
that,
game.
Squid. Yeah, sorry. It's not over yet.
Yeah, so let's talk about interaction in this game. What do you think?
Yeah, so New Bedford has a pretty indirect level of interaction. You place your workers, you're just kind of racing to get somewhere before someone else does, but you can't really do anything to just stop somebody.
Yeah, I mean, you want to think about it like a lot of other worker placement games, where you do want to pay attention to what other people are doing, what resources they have in hand, what things they need for the next step in the process, because if it's the same thing that you want, you might want to change up what you're doing on that turn, or kind of the order that you execute things.
Yeah, with the exception of a couple of the victory point buildings, I found the thing you really want to pay most attention to the other players is where are they in terms of sending their boats out.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the thing to pay attention to, and it's sometimes hard to track, right? In a lot of ways, it makes sense to send your boat out early because there are more whales, there's a higher proportion of whales, and particularly the higher victory point whales, in the ocean bag. But if you plan to go out and then everyone else sends their boats right after you, you're going to get kind of hosed with actually getting whales.
Yeah. The one building in this game that I think really encourages the most direct player interaction is this guy, the lighthouse. It makes it so that your boat moves out farther into the ocean. And actually, if there are other boats there, you get to cut in front of them, which is a pretty powerful and nasty thing to have happen in the middle of the game.
Yeah, it can actually be fairly cutthroat for a worker placement game, I think. I mean, it changes the whole dynamic of the whaling game. But, that building may actually never come out, and that really impacts the interaction.
Right.
What kind of tone the interaction is going to take with the other players.
Yeah, if you're playing with a game group that's pretty low on interaction, I can just see no one being interested in building this.
So overall, I mean, it is indirect. It is kind of that classic Euro game. You're kind of building up, thinking about what you need, and kind of playing around the other players. But there are kind of things that you need to keep in mind in terms of what choices the other players are making.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think it's just this. It's the standard Euro level of interaction. So, Squid, I'm curious what you think about the theme of this game. I mean, I bought it for us because I know that you love whaling and Moby Dick.
Yeah, I mean, 19th century whaling is an obsession of mine. And I think that this is a really, tight, compact game, but I'm really kind of torn about the theme. I think that the whaling mechanism itself, and, the way that the ships move, and the way that you kind of overfish the ocean, and all of that is really clever, really succinct, uses the mechanisms in a way that really play into the theme. However, the majority of the game is kind of, you're set in the town of New Bedford, and you're building your districts, you're building these buildings, and that really feels like any number of other Euro games, and doesn't really, in my mind, tie to whaling very much. I mean, a lot of this for me, it's very different, but aspects of this really feel like Keyflower, you build your buildings, you're building up your little town, in this case it's districts, and I use your buildings, I pay you money to use them to optimize my choices, and that can be any game.
Yeah, I think I'm echoing a lot of your sentiments here. The game is called New Bedford, a game of historic whaling and town building, and I really kind of wish it was more a game of historic whaling. Mm-hmm. I really love the whaling components, the fact that the ships furthest out get the biggest whales, the fact that as the game goes on, the whale bag just turns worse and worse and worse. All that is really cool, and you actually feel it happening in the game. I mean, at the beginning, you get nothing, and then all of a sudden you're just fishing up old boots over and over again, and that's funny. I mean, it does lead to some pretty entertaining little moments there. Yeah. But I agree that it kind of lacks in that. And I think actually the main reason that it does is because I don't know who I am in this game. If I'm historically whaling and town building, I need to be some sort of J.P. Morgan figure who's interested in whaling or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of joked about that at the end of our gameplay, right? That, we don't know, what it is when you win, what it means in terms of the flavor and what's going on in the game, but what it is. You know, when you're, it seems like you're the investor in New Bedford, as opposed to, where it could be more fun if you were the captain of the game, of the ship, and like everything. Instead, all these mechanisms worked around like training your sailors and whatever the kinds of things you need to do to prepare your ship to go out and whale.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the mechanisms of this game. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, at its core, we've mentioned this a couple of times, but it is a worker placement game, and it doesn't really pretend to be anything else.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that, with that in mind, it's actually a really great kind of intro worker placement game. So if you are, have a game group with kind of new players in general, or people that are new to this style of game, it's a really great choice, right? Because a lot of the things that make worker placement games kind of stressful or complicated are missing here. You have, each turn you have only 2 workers, and so only 2 actions that you're taking. And, you're not trying to think through when you're going to pass and when you're going to play. I mean, you play your 2 actions, first player rotates around the game. The
speed at which the buildings come out, too, is like pretty controllable. I actually see a lot of similarities between this and Lords of Waterdeep, where you are building slowly kind of extra buildings over the course of the game. There's more actions to be taken that way. And I guess the whaling mechanism seems a little bit more complicated than some of the things in Lords of Waterdeep, but Lords of Waterdeep also has hidden cards, which is always a barrier for new players. So, and actually, in some ways, I actually think New Bedford is maybe one that you can get to the table even easier.
Yeah, and I know that we, a lot of times Lords of Waterdeep is kind of touted out as this kind of great intro worker placement game, and I would agree. I mean, I think that this is another option and possibly even a better one, because I think that it really focuses on just those worker placement mechanisms, right? It doesn't have the cards or kind of these other things going on.
Yeah. We've talked kind of at length about in this video about the whaling track and sort of how we feel about that, and we both really like it, but at the same time, once I've placed my boat out there, it is almost just like a math. It's a number cruncher. It's a statistics thing. It's not something that I actually interact with once my boat is at sea.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I think it's a really neat mechanism, but it isn't one you interact with. I think that if, for example, you wanted to use this game, which I think it could be in a situation with children or like as an educational thing, I actually think that the ocean bag is really neat in how, it takes this like very, straightforward, basic mechanism and makes a really clear point about overfishing and kind of what happened historically to the whaling industry. And so I think that that's really clever, but I agree that it's not necessarily something that you interact with or something that you plan around in any way.
Right. One thing that we haven't really talked about yet is some of the buildings just change the way the game gets played. For instance, I'm thinking of Try-Works, which is where you just get to, if you have some whales out on the ocean, you can return them for free. And so it's specifically right whales, so you kind of have to angle for that specific kind of strategy. That isn't necessarily just get resources. It's I need to get this thing, and then I convert that thing.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that in general, the choice, because the fact that you're not going to have all the buildings that are available come out in each game. And the choice of buildings and kind of what your kind of focus is can become part of your strategy, and I think that's, interesting because you also have full awareness of what your choices are. As opposed to some other games where that's like a thing. You get to choose, buy buildings. Generally, they're hidden for most of it, and you're kind of playing on a shorter thing. Here, if you wanted to, you could kind of plan a strategy around, getting these buildings out to be able to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah. Yeah, it's worth noting also that there's no input randomness into the game. What I mean by that is what you're saying about the buildings, like what buildings there are as options at the beginning. The only thing is actually output randomness. If you're whaling, you don't know how lucky you're going to be with the wet bag. And that just leads to some different results for different players as well.
Sure, and I think that, as is true in most games, a lot of the uncertainty really comes from the other players and what choices they're going to make, right? Like, you don't know how well you're going to do when you're out whaling, one, because of, what's in the bag and kind of the randomness of pooling, but also, if more people, all of a sudden the next turn, everybody else puts their boats out, that's going to be a problem for you. Okay, so we talked a lot about, like, what this game looks like through the process of playing it. How do you feel about, like, endgame scoring, about how well the scores kind of reflect how you played in the game, things like that?
So one of the things I think is really important to notice about this game is that it is a game of tactics, not strategy. It's really hard for me to build an engine because of the whole first player going to a building is the only one that can go there. So I can't necessarily sit and just do the same thing or build up like a little system. I'm going to make decisions over the course of the game over, okay, this is what's best for me now, this is what's best for me next. And it feels like all those little edges just kind of will build up over the course of the game. Endgame scores that we've seen so far have been within, 6 points of each other from top to bottom, basically. So it's a game with a very, very tight scoring range, and I have a hard time seeing it being anything except for that.
Sure. So do you think, with that in mind, and I agree, I think that it is a much more tactical than strategic game, do you think that the end game scores are kind of reflective of, kind of how well you played, or do you think that it's kind of chance and being screwed out of things? Kind of how do you feel about that?
I mean, I do think that there is a correlation between you played well in the game, you understood what you were supposed to be going for. If you built the right kind of building at the beginning and you got some extra dollars for it, or you had some expectation at the end of how many whales you're going to have, and you have the money to be prepared for it, then you get rewarded for that kind of thing. You get rewarded for other things like the victory point buildings if you are paying attention to when you need to get those.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I think that, part of it is like making the choices along the way, being that it is tactical and you're kind of seeing what other people are doing, and you may have started with some thought about what it is that you wanted to do to get to where you wanted to go, and you kind of been hosed out of it. I was one to play, ships early, and so because of that, people would come in behind me, and I kind of ended up with the less valuable, quote-unquote, whales. And so I saw there is a victory point building specifically around right whales, and being able to pick that up at the appropriate time, seeing that was kind of how I was getting my victory points, and that ended up working really well, and it took me kind of observing and kind of choosing that at the right time. So yeah, using those tactics kind of played out well in that way, I think.
Yeah, the pieces of this game, if you are aware, seem to kind of pull your scores together. If you get, people took all these other good whales from me, I'll build this other building, which is good because it keeps everyone feeling in the game, but it's very rare that at the end of the game you're going to be like, oh my god, whatever whale did that game is what I want to do next game. Like, that was cool.
Right. It's true. Yeah, you're never going to have a full game strategy that is just magnificent.
Right. But to your other question, it does feel like if you play the game well, you're generally going to be rewarded at the end for it.
I mean, I think one of the other cool things, it's worth noting again about the tactical versus the strategic side of it is, again, if you want to use this as an intro game for people that aren't as familiar with gaming or this style of gaming, it's one that, you pay a few rounds, they pick up on what's going on, and, you can feel involved, and you can feel like you can play the game, and it's not like you're just getting hosed by the people that have played previously or are more advanced gamers, which is nice.
Yeah, and to go back to the new player thing, I mean, it's another game where if you get stuff at the beginning, it doesn't really matter what you get, you're going to be able to turn into points somehow.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, the value of the game is how many times you're going to get it to the table. So let's talk about what's novel about it, what's replayable about it.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of talked about how, in a lot of ways, this is a worker placement game in a very standard way, and, we've got tons of those. But one of the things that I think is really cool about this game is, the order in which the buildings come out really impacts gameplay. So, we've played games where what you're focusing on and how it goes have been completely different. There's certain things, if buildings that give you money come out early, people choose to build those, then, you're going to be flush for money, and that's not going to be a concern. Or, in some cases, it's, there's going to be a scarce resource and an unscarce resource, which are pretty standard things in a lot of these types of games. But there's also these buildings that do kind of funky things, and, whether they come out or when they come out makes a huge difference. Like we made a reference earlier in this video to the lighthouse, which really gives your boats more opportunity to not only stay out longer and get more whales, but also to kind of push you forward in the order of when you get to choose your whales out of the back, so you're going to get the better whales, and that's going to make it kind of a more competitive and or malleable aspect of this game, right?
Yeah, I'm absolutely a sucker for games where you get to build the action spaces as you go on. I like Lords of Waterdeep for that reason with the building buildings, and Agricola I really enjoy, when are the things going to come out kind of affects the gameplay. But in this one, what's cool is that you can actually, a couple buildings might come out per turn, or only one is really the most efficient. And so the way that you look at the game is very different. In all the games that we've played, people have noticed very quickly that money is important. And so those buildings have come out very quickly. The bank, I think, gets built very often. Mm-hmm. But I'm very curious what this game feels like when everyone is choked for cash.
Yeah.
That's something we haven't actually experienced when we play this game. And so I am excited to get it to the table again. We've talked about it being pretty standard, but I want to play again because I want to see what that game looks like.
Definitely, and I want to see if there are more ways to manipulate or to play differently in the whaling track, and kind of, how maybe delaying further. I've never played a game where I'm waiting until, I don't know, turn 6 to throw out my first boat.
Yeah, alternative, we haven't even talked about games where you just throw out like really quick boats. Send out a boat with only 2 turns, and is that a thing that works at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are, again, these kind of tactical things that can play out and are worth playing through. And, the game is a quick enough game. It's not like a game that you have to put on the table and sit down for 4 hours. I mean, it plays between, I don't know, between an hour and 2, probably closer to an hour.
Yeah.
So it's easy to get on the table and kind of, even if you just want to try it out, to try kind of a different set of tactics.
Right.
It's a fun one to kind of pull out in that way.
Absolutely. Something worth mentioning, by the way, this is not a big deal for me, but might be for some of you guys out there, is that you can actually play New Bedford as one player.
Mm-hmm.
And the game has rules for how basically a CPU player sort of operates, and the different ones have different sort of personalities. So there's an Ahab who really loves whaling, and there's is it the Stubbs is the one that wants to build stuff?
He's never read Moby Dick.
Sorry.
So, and this is another thing too, for those of you who are really also into like the flavor of Moby Dick, they actually do this fun thing where you get to choose to play against an autopilot, but in a lot of other games that have one-player things, it's like a kind of standard autopilot.
Right.
These do have kind of built-in personalities to them. So you have Flask and Ahab and Starbuck and Stubb, and they kind of all kind of do things a little bit differently. So you get to kind of replay a little bit differently, and it's kind of a different game in a lot of ways than when you're playing in the multiplayer game.
That's right. So I mean, the other thing to mention about replayability or just value of this game is that it's a pretty cheap game to pick up. I mean, you see this box; it's not terribly large. Mm-hmm. The price reflects that, but it has a full game feel
mm-hmm.
to it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think in the same way, the pieces aren't like the most beautiful things you'll ever see, but I think that you still get the representative feel from them. Like I actually kind of
I do love these wood and brick pieces a lot.
And I actually love the little pictures of the whales on the tiles.
The crackers, I mean, you can eat them. They have holes in them.
I think to make it more accurate, you need to have weevils kind of popping out of these, but yeah, I mean, it does give you the feel of like the time and like the flavor is integrated into the pieces, but I think because they're a little bit more simplistic, again, it brings down that price point, which is nice. And it's compact and light, so you can travel with it pretty easily too.
I actually think the last and most important thing to talk about is how awful the colors are on the worker meeples in this game. I mean, yellow and orange and green and blue, which on the boats look almost exactly the same. Terrible. We
literally had to augment our ships to tell the difference between the blue and the green. We had to like put little dots on them because we couldn't tell when they were out to sea, what the colors were. I mean, and that's, that's kind of a pain, but it is something that you can work around.
Yeah.
So, Will, does this quench your thirst for the open ocean?
I mean, no, but, it did make it so that we finished our first video review.
Yeah!
Boom.
So, what do you think of New Bedford overall?
Yeah, I mean, overall, it's a solid game. If I go through the kind of checklist, like, am I happy that I own it? Yes. Am I happy that I spent the money to buy it? Yeah, I mean, it makes me happy. I get a table. It's good to play. It's not going to be one of my favorites, but it does what it does, and it does that well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with that. I think, it's a great little worker placement game. Again, it really shows those mechanisms well. It plays fairly quickly. It's a really fairly easy game to explain the rules, which is always nice. And as somebody who loves the idea of the theme anyway, I mean, I think, it doesn't do a perfect job. I think that it could be a bit better, but I think that it's fun, and I think that it does bring you back into that moment. Yeah. So, for all of you that are looking for a game because you're really into 19th century whaling, I think it's a solid pick.
Absolutely. Thanks for watching our first video review.
We'll see you next time.